Okay, well, thank you so much, Florian, for that kind introduction. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Wolf and Alexander, for agreeing to give responses, and of course the team at CAPAS for so generously, kindly hosting me here in Heidelberg this term and giving me the chance to talk to you this afternoon about the Crusades and apocalyptic thought in the Middle Ages. So my research is concerned with how medieval perceptions of the end times interfaced with ideas concerning the brand of pre-modern holy warfare known as the Crusades. These expeditions captured the imaginations of medieval observers, and for better or worse, mostly worse, many in the modern era as well. So I'm starting by showing you two images. The first is already there on my opening slide. It's from a painting which features in an early 14th century manuscript produced in England. The image is often titled Christ Leading the Crusaders, and it shows a band of knights following Christ, who, you might be able to see, is ready for war. Besides riding a war horse, exactly like those under the knights behind him, he carries a sword in his mouth. In the top left of the image, up here, is a saint who's also a kind of learned churchman, and we know that from the book that he's holding in his hand. So with good reason, this image is very often featured in modern scholarship on the Crusades. It represents a kind of key feature of what we might call crusading spirituality. That is, the religious ideas of medieval Christians who participated in and supported the Crusades. This not only included the belief that to go on crusade was to do Christ's work, but also that Crusader armies enjoyed divine approval, even that Christ and his saints periodically intervened in battles to bring about victory. Now, there is, you may suspect, more to say about this particular image, and I'll come back to it at the end of my paper and do just that. My second image is of another medieval artifact that is featured in modern scholarship on the Crusades. It's the famous tympanum of the Church of Saint Foy in the French town of Conques. It was created within about 50 years of the end of the First Crusade. The First Crusade ended in 1099. It's the date of its creation that explains why Crusades historians have been so interested in it. Some historians regard it as a powerful representation of Christian spirituality in the 12th century, the formative age of crusading. The tympanum, as you may be able to see, depicts the Last Judgment. At its center is Christ Pantocrator, that is, Christ as judge, sitting in majesty after his second coming at the end of time. The scenes around him represent a division between the blessed and the damned. So below him, the dead clamber out of their tombs. To his right, Christ is welcoming the elect, beginning with Mary, St. Peter. Below them is heaven, where the peaceful, blessed repose. And with his hand, he gestures to the bottom right of the scene, where damned sinners are tortured by horrible beasts. Now, traces of paint survive on the tympanum sculptures. Using them as a guide, modern lighting technology has been used to create a nighttime display that transforms the tympanum into how it may have looked during the Middle Ages. It brings the sculpture's imagery and the ideas it embodies to vivid life. Now, to modern observers, this might simply be impressive art. In the Middle Ages, this sculpture represented a very inescapable and inevitable reality. At some point, the end times would begin. At that point, Christ would sit in judgment of mankind. Now, most Crusade historians working today would accept that the devotional impulses articulated in the tympanum, above all, fears linked to the dangers of sin and the importance of redeeming that sin, were integral elements of crusading. From the start, the church promised prospective crusaders that by taking part, they would have their sins remitted. The slate would be wiped clean. And this was vitally important in an age in which members of society were concerned about their spiritual welfare and profoundly afraid at the prospect of spending eternity here, in this part of the tympanum, the place represented in that part of the tympanum. Yet, among historians of the Crusades, the notion that this Crusader spirituality connected to medieval ideas about the end times has proved far more contested. Indeed, one influential school of scholarship doubts that there was much of a connection at all. And it's this discussion that my research is in conversation with. Briefly put, I'm asking the question of how widely ideas about the end times shaped perceptions of the Crusades in the Middle Ages. So I've divided my talk into the following 4 sections. Firstly, to give context, I'll introduce the Crusades before discussing the key terms that we use, in English at least, to talk about the end times, and then 3 key texts, important texts, that tell us about the development of those ideas. Secondly, I'll talk about the educated elite churchmen who wrote Latin chronicles about the First Crusade, and consider how some of them drew from apocalyptic ideas and motifs. And this will serve the dual function of introducing you to the type of work that I, as a medieval historian, do. Thirdly, I'll frame my project by talking about historiography on this topic. That is, the discussions that modern historians have had over the nature of the link between the Crusades and ideas about the end times. In the 4th part, I'll focus on the research project I'm pursuing this term, and I'll discuss what a body of texts written in vernacular French and known as the Chansons de Geste tell us about the connection between ideas on the end times and the Crusades. Briefly put, I'll argue that these texts provide evidence that has the potential to advance scholarly debates on this question. I'll posit that it was not only churchmen who made this connection, but that this connection may have had a wider influence upon medieval society, wider than some modern historians have sometimes recognized. Yes, so while I'm focusing on my kind of specific area of medieval history, the work I've been doing has led me to formulate 3 broader interlinked questions, and I include them here. Perhaps they might be used for inspiration in all other types of projects, other disciplines beyond history. They are as follows. In a given society, who frames ideas about the end times? What ideas, texts, and traditions do those figures draw from in order to do so? And finally, to whom in society are those ideas directed, and do they reach all parts of society? So as I say, these might be questions that will be usefully applied in other settings. So part 1, definitions and key texts, beginning with the Crusades themselves. So the Crusades were a series of religiously inspired military expeditions and associated episodes of conquest and settlement that generally originated in northwestern Europe and which were carried out across at least 5 centuries after the call for the First Crusade in 1095. And while some of these expeditions targeted regions such as Eastern Europe, the Baltic lands, the south of France, and the Iberian Peninsula, it was the expeditions directed to the Eastern Mediterranean that most strongly captured medieval imaginations. These Holy Land Crusades, carried out in the 12th and 13th centuries, were aimed at taking, defending, or recovering the Holy City of Jerusalem, as well as the Christian-held territory that was held in the Near East between 1097 and 1291. It's this territory here. So, moving on to the 3 key terms that I want to discuss, the 3 English terms at least, that help us to think about Christian concepts of the end times. Now for this, I found the terminological framework provided by Richard Landers particularly useful. So his definitions, summarized and adapted by me, are there on the slide. Firstly, eschatology. This stems from the Greek word eskatos, meaning last, and this concerns the notion that at the end of time, on the day of judgment, Christ would judge the living and the newly resurrected dead, and that he will reward the good and punish the bad. In other words, this refers to an intrinsic and foundational element of Christian belief. Apocalypticism, deriving from the Greek word apocalypsis, meaning revelation, in the sense of the revelation of a divine secret. This concerns the belief that the day of judgment is close enough at hand for believers to change their behavior in anticipation of it. This is the point I really want to emphasize, the difference between eschatology and apocalypticism. It's the sense of imminence, proximity, the sense of something happening or about to happen is what differentiates eschatology from apocalypticism. Thirdly, millenarianism. This term is ultimately related to the Latin word mille, meaning 1,000, and it evokes beliefs that at the end times, all saved souls would be rewarded by a perfected earthly society, often connected to the belief that Christ would, after his return, after the second coming, reign for 1,000 years. That's a concept that is articulated a few times in the Bible, including the book of Revelation. Now, clearly, each of these three terms has a range of meanings, some of which, of course, overlap. Nonetheless, I think this is, as a starting point, a useful conceptual basis. You may also have noted I'm using the more neutral word, end times, as a shorthand that encompasses all three of these phrases and their associated impulses without necessarily committing firmly to any of them. So the three key texts in the development of Christian apocalyptic thought, or as I've been calling them at CAPAS, religious benchmarks. So these were three texts that strongly influenced eschatological thought in the Middle Ages, and which are thus kind of occupying an important place in my own research. The first is the book of Daniel, so evidently written in the 2nd century before Christ. It forms part of both the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the Christian Old Testament. It's set 4 centuries earlier than its apparent date of composition, and tells the story of the titular Daniel, a Jew from Jerusalem, and Daniel's exploits in the captivity of King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. So the book recounts a series of prophetic visions received by Daniel, which are taking to shed light on God's plan for the world, including God's plan for its end. Second key text is the book of Revelation, believed to have been written around the year 95 years after Christ, by an author usually identified as John of Patmos. It's the final book of the Christian New Testament. It is perhaps the single most important source for Christian ideas about the end times. So its name in English comes from the Latin revelatio, in turn, a word translated from the Greek apocalypsis. Echoing the book of Daniel, Revelation conveys a series of visions experienced by its eponymous author, John. Unlike Daniel before it, John's apocalypse purports to recount God's plan for the world to culminate in the second coming of Christ and his 1,000-year reign. The third text I'll briefly discuss is attributed to the author known as Pseudo-Methodius. So this text purports, it claims in the text itself to have been written by one Methodius of Patara, a bishop who died a Christian martyr around the year 310. In fact, the text was probably written more than 3 centuries after that, around about 680 in Syria. It was translated from Syriac into Latin in the 8th century, and thereafter circulated widely during the Middle Ages. Now, what's important about this text is that it attempts to bring the rise of Islam into the framework of Christian eschatology. It's also the earliest known text to record the apocalyptic tradition centered upon a prophetic figure known by a number of names, but whom I will call the last world emperor. In German, this figure is often known as the Endzeitkaiser or the Weltkaiser. Now, this was a figure who, according to Pseudo-Methodius, would be called upon to fight the enemies of Christ, above all, adherents of Islam. He would do so by unifying Christendom before leading Christendom, a unified Christendom, into battle. Once Christ's enemies were defeated, so the tradition goes, the emperor would go to Jerusalem and relinquish his power to God by laying down his crown. After this, Antichrist would appear, and the events recorded in the book of Revelation would begin. Now, of course, there were other important texts, but these three in particular exerted a significant influence upon Christian eschatology. All highly ambivalent and open to a wide range of interpretations, They were used for tools. They were used as tools for trying to work out details like when, where, how, and through whose actions the apocalypse would start. In short, they were believed to contain messages that could reveal God's divine plan. So, moving on to the second part of my paper, looking at the First Crusade and the apocalypse. In this part, I'll discuss how educated churchmen who wrote Latin chronicles about the First Crusade following its end in 1099 drew from eschatological and apocalyptic motifs in order to describe it. This will give valuable context to my inquiry and convey a sense of the work that medieval historians do on subjects related to apocalypticism. Now, it is possible that the First Crusade started to be framed in eschatological terms from the very start. The expedition was called by Pope Urban II in the town of Clermont on the 27th of November, 1095, and about a decade later, which is why we must be cautious, a monastic chronicler from northern France named Guibert Nogent wrote an account of the Pope's fateful speech that explicitly frames the Crusade in eschatological and even apocalyptic terms. In Guibert's version of the Pope's speech, Urban speaks explicitly about the approaching times of the Antichrist. And he has the Pope saying that Christians needed to take possession of Jerusalem so that they would be there in the right place when Antichrist appeared, so that they were there already to fight him. Guibert also has the Pope explicitly invoking the book of Daniel to say where in Jerusalem the Antichrist would begin assembling his forces. The Latin chroniclers of the First Crusade, learned churchmen with a close familiarity with the Bible and other Christian texts, generally, however, did not make such explicit connections between the expedition and the end times. They did, though, make very often more implicit associations. One such instance comes in a passage contained in the text known as the Geste Francorum, the earliest surviving full-length text, full-length accounts of the Crusade by a participant completed within a year or two of the end of the Crusade. So the author reports at one point that as the Crusaders fought a major battle on the 28th of June 1098 at the city of Antioch, they received divine assistance as follows. You can see it here on the slide. Then also appeared from the mountains a countless host of men on white horses, whose banners were all white. When our men saw this, they did not understand what was happening or who these men might be, until they realized this was the aid sent by Christ, and that the leaders of this army were St. George, St. Mercurius, and St. Demetrius. In fact, this invokes imagery found in the book of Revelation, chapter 19, verses 11 to 15. In that passage, the narrator, John of Patmos, describes the coming of the apocalypse and seeing a rider on a white horse accompanied by armies of heaven, executus qui sunt in caelo, also riding white horses. Another ecclesiastical chronicler of the Crusade, Raymond of Aguilera, drew from apocalyptic imagery to describe the culminating moments of the Crusade on the 15th of July, 1099. On that day, the Crusader armies who had been besieging the holy city of Jerusalem broke into the city before indiscriminately slaughtering thousands of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Raymond describes these scenes before turning to describe what happened around the Temple of Solomon, what Muslims know as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He says, "So we relate what took place there in the Temple of Solomon. If we told you, we would go beyond what is believable. So it is sufficient to relate that in the Temple of Solomon and the portico, Crusaders rode in blood to the knees and up to the bridles of their horses." This implausible amount of blood is actually a reference to Revelation, chapter 14, verse 20. In that passage, John tells us what would unfold during the end times as follows. The verse reads, "And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even to the horses' bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs." Now, there are different ways of interpreting Raymond's claim. To my mind, we should not read this as a literal description of the amount of blood that was shed at the temple that day, but as a metaphorical invocation, using apocalyptic imagery drawn from Revelation to convey the sense that the Crusaders had carried out an act of religious purification in the Holy City. That's how they saw it. There are also indications that apocalyptic expectations may have shaped what happened in Jerusalem exactly a week later, on the 22nd of July, 1099, as the leaders of the Crusade met to decide which of them would be appointed to rule over the city. The man they chose was Godfrey of Bouillon. However, Raymond of Aguilera, the chronicler, tells us that some in the army were anxious at the idea of someone becoming king of Jerusalem. Evidently, there was concern about the prospect of a ruler wearing a crown of gold, in precisely the place where Christ had, during his passion, been forced to wear a crown of thorns. This concern may, in turn, have been shaped by the fear that basically doing this would trigger the apocalypse. Let's think about the work of Pseudo-Methodius, once again, and the tradition of the last world emperor. According to that tradition, a powerful ruler would defeat the enemies of Christ before laying down his crown in Jerusalem. This would prompt the appearance of the Antichrist and start the apocalypse. In 1099, this may all have had a kind of familiar sound to it. So the thinking may thus have been that if Godfrey was not given a crown in the first place, he couldn't lay it down and therefore couldn't start accidentally the apocalypse. And very briefly, this statue, it connects to the project that Florian mentioned. It's in Brussels, erected in 1848. And this represents modern 19th century nationalistic Belgian interest in the memory of Godfrey of Bouillon. I am showing you this for a reason, trust me. I'll come back to it later and it will make more sense. Okay, so the third part of the lecture in which I frame my research. So, thus far I've suggested, using examples drawn from the Latin chronicles, that some medieval Christians did see the First Crusade in eschatological terms. We need, though, to ask a vital question. How far did the concerns about the end times actually influence the thoughts and actions of aristocratic arms bearers, we could say knights, before and during expeditions? Or are we dealing simply with how learned minds, these churchmen, these educated elite minds, like Raymond of Aguilera, like Guibert of Nogent, are we dealing simply with how they used eschatological and apocalyptic imagery retrospectively to interpret crusading history? To begin answering this question, it is, I think, useful to consider how modern scholars have dealt with the broad subject of crusading and medieval eschatology. Now, on this subject, there are influential national schools of scholarship with important work produced by both French and German scholars, some of which I've listed on the handout. Above all, though, my approach is influenced by historiographical developments in the English-speaking world. So in the past half century or so, a school of historians in Britain has had a very significant impact on modern understanding of the Crusades. Significant here, above all, is the work of Jonathan Riley-Smith, as reflected, for example, in his 1986 book, First Crusade and the Idea of Crusading. And this book examines the ideological antecedents, response to, and conceptual development of the expedition. His work, built upon in his own subsequent publications and by the work of his many doctoral students, minimalizes the role of eschatological thought. This approach, instead, emphasizes other features of medieval spirituality to account for the Crusades. Particular emphasis is placed on pilgrimage and the shared kind of tradition between pilgrimage and crusading. Concerns about sin and its remission, and the idea that crusading was a means of expressing love, including love for God. In this 1986 book, Riley-Smith does briefly consider the possible influence of eschatological thought during the First Crusade, but only when discussing what prompted early bands of crusaders to attack Jewish communities in the Rhineland in the year 1096. These crusaders are framed as a kind of extreme element, standing somewhat apart from the main forces of the crusade, which set out later in 1096 on the day that the Pope had indicated. And as regards the motivation of the crusade as a whole, Riley Smith concludes, and here I'm quoting, the evidence is not copious enough for us to suppose that eschatological ideas were widespread among the crusaders. So he does not devote particular attention to the place of eschatological thought in the wider devotional framework of the crusade. With all this in mind, the choice of cover image for a 2009 revised version of the book, which you can see up here, seems to me a particularly interesting choice. Now, in contrast, in the past decade or two, a number of historians, most of them based in the USA, have taken an explicitly apocalyptic approach to crusading history. Jessalyn Bird, herself a prominent crusade scholar, attributes this to two key developments. Firstly, a renewal of interest in apocalypticism, driven by interest in the ending of the second millennium, Y2K and all that. And secondly, the resurgence of religious warfare in the wake of the attacks of September the 11th, 2001. Scholars who have taken this apocalyptic approach include Matthew Gabriel, Philippe Buch, and Brett Whalen. Again, they're on the handout. Most important, though, is the work of Jay Rubenstein, who has produced a series of publications on this subject, culminating in his 2019 book, Nebuchadnezzar's Dream, The Crusades, Apocalyptic Prophecy, and the End of History. So that book traces in detail the influence of apocalyptic thought in crusading history from the inception of the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century down to about 1200. Now, his work has firmly put the end times at the very heart of historiographical discussions. I think it's notable that Rubenstein holds that participants in the First Crusade, including the secular aristocratic lords, perhaps we can call them knights, who led it, he believes they actually did harbor eschatological and even apocalyptic ideas. In one 2008 chapter, for instance, Rubenstein argues that Godfrey of Bouillon himself was very much mindful of this tradition of the last world emperor when he accepted the rule of Jerusalem in 1099, but refused a crown. There has, however, been a kind of pushback, a very firm one, against this approach from other historians, particularly from that British school, that aforementioned British school. In a review of a 2011 book by Rubenstein, for instance, Riley Smith was very critical of this approach. He wrote, Rubenstein sets out to treat the First Crusade as an example of apocalyptic warfare. He is not deterred by the fact that he has comparatively little direct evidence on which to base his thesis. So, in the eyes of this school, not so much apocalypse now as apocalypse not. So my own work is very much shaped by these discussions, and so far I have two key observations. Firstly, in my view, this historiographical pushback we have seen against work that interrogates the apocalyptic dimensions of the Crusades has distracted scholars from thinking about eschatology more generally. So by that, I mean criticism of scholarship that contends that the Crusaders believed that the end times were imminent has evidently led scholars to avoid acknowledging the fact that, as medieval Christians, the Crusaders would have accepted as an essential truth that at some point Christ would return and the end times would begin. Simply put, it seems to me that we should not throw out the eschatological baby with the apocalyptic bathwater. Sorry for that analogy, it stretched it somewhat. Secondly, connected to the first point, I believe there is potential to move beyond the debate about what educated ecclesiastical chroniclers may or may not have thought about all of this, and explore instead the beliefs of the secular aristocratic arms bearers of medieval Europe. That is exactly the demographic upon whom the church called to participate in crusades in the centuries after 1095. It's with those 2 points in mind that I began to look at the evidence contained in a body of medieval texts known as the Chansons de Geste, and it's to these that I'll turn in the fourth and final part of my paper. Okay, so part 4, Crusading, the End Times, and the Chansons de Geste. So in this part, I'll firstly talk about the Chansons de Geste as a genre before assessing the specific chansons that deal precisely with the Crusades. So these are poems. The chansons are poems that celebrate the exploits of famous noble warriors. The French term, chanson de geste, derived from the Latin re geste, literally meaning things done. We might translate this into English as songs of deeds. Now, these chansons were written between 1100 and 1500, thereabouts. Most, however, were composed in the 12th and 13th century. A number of languages with a language of composition, but by far the most kind of popular language in which to compose these was Old French. This was a language that was spoken in northern France and in England in the 12th and 13th century. These chansons originated as spoken texts. They were composed in rhyme and structured into verses or laisses, as that's the French term for the verse, of varying length, and so it seems publicly performed to secular aristocratic audiences at communal gatherings, such as courtly assemblies and so forth. The key point is that in an age when the writing and reading of history was carried out almost exclusively by learned churchmen, the chansons have the potential to reach a wider and more diverse audience. They were primarily conceived as works of entertainment for those aristocratic audiences, but they served other functions too. Ultimately, they are the cultural output of a Christian society that was, in the 12th and 13th century, increasingly belligerent and expansionist. Many chansons quite explicitly encouraged their listeners to unite in the name of Christendom and to support warfare against Christ's enemies, above all, the world of Islam. And I should say, if you have any interest in knowing what a chanson sounded like, on the handout I've listed a short YouTube clip where someone performs an excerpt from one of the more famous examples. Now, over time, different groups or cycles of chansons took shape. The most famous cycle focused upon Charlemagne, and includes by far the most famous song, the Chansons de Roland, the song of Roland. My interest is in the cycle of chansons that took shape around the Crusades, and more specifically, the First Crusade. Around about the year 1200, that's about a century after the First Crusade ended, in northern France, 3 pre-existing songs relating to the expedition, the Chanson d'Antioche, the Chanson des Chétifs, and the Chanson de Jérusalem, were reworked into a unified trilogy. The first, the Antioche, sets out a version of the history of the First Crusade from its origins to the aftermath of the Battle of Antioch, in the length of about 9,500 lines. The third song, the Jérusalem, just under 10,000 lines long, covers the rest of the Crusade, concluding in the aftermath, Jerusalem's capture. And the other song, Les Chétifs, or the Captives, in English, about 4,000 lines long, it purports to describe events that took place between the other two, kind of interlude. So, while this trilogy was partly based on the historical First Crusade, their narratives differ significantly from the Latin chronicles. They contain exaggerated, amended, invented episodes and characters. It would be very unwise to try and use these songs to reconstruct the First Crusade. I thus approach them as fiction, but as fiction that provides insights into medieval ideas about the Crusades. In this regard, they are an invaluable body of evidence. And what I'm doing is considering what these chansons, these crusading chansons de geste, tell us about the link between the Crusades and eschatological thought. And for the rest of my paper, I'll present some preliminary findings, citing the songs by verse or less number. My overall argument is that these chansons are not apocalyptic texts, in that they do not frame the end times as imminent, However, and this is really the crucial point, they are eschatological texts. They demonstrate a sustained and at times sophisticated awareness of Christian eschatology, framing history as beginning with God's creation of the world to culminate at some point in the future with Christ's second coming. How then are these ideas manifest? At a number of points in the trilogy, the end times are explicitly evoked. We get references to the Antichrist, invariably by through derogatory references to the Crusaders' Muslim enemies. So they're called the descendants of the Antichrist, the race of the Antichrist, and so on. Similarly, the Muslim enemies are associated with the devil, so they're the people of the devil, the greedy allies of the devil, the race of the devil, so on and so forth. Explicit reference is also made to the Last Judgment and the role that Christ would play as ultimate judge. So when discussing the long siege of the city of Antioch, for example, the song says, as you can see here, the Christians could attack this place until the day of judgment and they wouldn't capture it. It's using that as a kind of mechanism for discussing the length of time. Similarly, we get in the Shetif and the Jerusalem invocations of Christ, who's described as Christ whose place is to judge the world. So these kind of references are throughout the texts. This shouldn't surprise us. Texts composed by Christians during the Middle Ages, when most ascribed to foundational beliefs about the end times, acknowledge those beliefs. Yet, the chansons also engage with Christian eschatology in a more sophisticated way. And in some ways, in some passages, they're evoked in ways that serves to legitimate the Crusades and articulate the rewards that were on offer to participants. Particularly important is the idea that Christian warriors would earn spiritual rewards from which they would benefit on the Day of Judgment. Now, often in the chansons, churchmen are depicted giving speeches that articulate important ideas about Christian belief. One scene in the Antioche, the character of Adama, Bishop of Lupi, he gives a speech after some crusaders had been killed in battle. He says the following: after the dead are buried, he says, "We are fighting a holy war. The souls of those we are burying here will not be in bondage like ours, and they will experience no pain until the day of judgment." Another point, the same figure, Adama, says, "Anyone who dies for God will have made a good conquest indeed, and be rewarded for it on the day of judgment. He will wear a crown on his head together with the holy angels. All the sins you have committed will be forgiven you." We also have another speech in the Jerusalem where another churchman says, in a kind of pre-battle speech, there are lots of those, he says to the Crusaders, "Each one of you will find eternal glory as God's liegeman or lanesman." So we're getting the rewards, spiritual rewards, framed in ways that a knight, an aristocratic arms bearer, could understand. Going back to the Antioche, we find in one scene an invocation of the end times that is one of the more intriguing passages in the whole city, in the whole trilogy. Another pre-battle speech, full of those. Adama talks about how the end times would unfold. He says, according to Scripture, on the day of judgment, 4 horns will ring out on Mount Tabor. The dead will be resurrected, and our Lord will address the living in the terms he has handed down to us. Then it purports to give a speech from Christ. This is a very difficult passage to analyze. We can say at least that Christ's speech in this passage resembles very closely a speech recounted in the book of Matthew. And it looks like Adama is drawing from the book of Revelation to talk about the end times. One might think he's doing that. In fact, he's using the text is giving him ideas that come not from the book of Revelation, but from a work that imitates it, the so-called pseudo-apocalypse or second apocalypse of John. So this is not a canonical part of the Bible. It's in the Apocrypha. And this raises all sorts of questions. How did the author or authors get hold of this text? Did they think it was the book of Revelation, as many throughout history have? Did they know it wasn't the book of Revelation, but pretended that it was? All sorts of questions are provoked. I don't have the answers to them. But my point, though, is the fact that the texts are provoking these questions is telling us that in eschatological terms, these are far more complex texts than might at first seem. We also have these ideas put into the mouths of the secular, aristocratic, knightly figures in the Crusades. At one point, for example, Godfrey, our friend Godfrey Bouillon, talks about the reputation that Crusaders would gain by participating. He says, from the start until the day of judgment, the pilgrims who took the sepulchre, where God died and rose again, and the whole land that produced him will enjoy fame. We also have another remarkable scene in Les Chétifs, the second song, centering upon the knight Ernul of Beauvais. Ernul is called upon to fight a beast called Satanus, or Satan. Sensing that the beast is about to kill him, Ernul invokes God, kind of beseeches the divine, and then gives a fairly detailed kind of description of how the Christian end times would unfold. I won't read it, but it's there on the slide. After concluding this speech, he picks a blade of grass from the ground and administers communion to himself. We are told, thinking about the day of judgment and the rewards that he would gain. So this knight, Ernul, is presented with a firm grasp of Christian eschatology. So, thus far, I've talked about, too far, explicit references to the end times. What's also the case is that these chants contain a number of implicit references to the end times. In a number of instances, such as the ones I've listed here on the slide, these motifs, this imagery is shared with the way that the imagery is used in the Latin chronicles. Perhaps the authors of the songs were borrowing those ideas directly from the Latin texts. It's hard to be sure. Maybe there's some kind of shared textual heritage that unites the two corpuses, Latin texts on the one hand, vernacular Old French chansons on the other. The key point, I think, is it is very significant that these are included in the chansons. It's telling us that what was good for the Latin chronicles, what resonated there, the authors of the chansons thought would also resonate to an audience of aristocratic arms bearers. So some references to this apocalyptic imagery are borrowed from the Latin chronicles. We recognize them. Even more important, we get original references in the chansons to apocalyptic motifs as well. One point in Les Chétifs, one of the titular captives of the song, Harpin of Bourges, is cornered by 4 lions who are intent on attacking him. He asks for divine assistance before drawing his sword. According to the song, at this point, God intervenes to prevent the lions from reaching him. This seems to be an invocation of the book of Daniel, 6:22, in which Daniel is thrown into a lion's den, only for God to prevent the lions from attacking him. My second example is from the Chansons de Geste. One point in that song, we're introduced to a monstrous race of bird-like creatures called the Espec, which a few passages later are sent to fight the Crusaders. Yeah, so the song gives us a description of what they look like, evil, flesh-eating birds. This imagery is evocative of, yeah, you guessed it, the book of Revelation, which speaks of birds who are called to eat the flesh of rich and poor alike. So my sense is that as my research continues, I'll uncover more uses of eschatological motifs in this trilogy of chansons. So let me pull all of this together with some concluding remarks. In broad terms, my research is aimed at the question of how widely the Crusades were understood in eschatological terms in the Middle Ages. My suggestion has been that the trilogy of Chansons de Geste about the First Crusade, composed around 1200, provide valuable evidence on this matter. I've not dealt with the question of what participants in the First Crusade did or didn't actually think. My aim instead has been to use these chansons to interrogate how secular arms bearers in later generations might have thought about the end times in connection to crusading. These texts are not apocalyptic in the sense they don't cast the end times as imminent, but they are eschatological. They explicitly invoke the end times. They also invoke the end times more implicitly, sometimes in ways that are shared with the Latin texts, other times ways that seem to be original. What's crucial is that they're framing these ideas in terms that were comprehensible, understandable to these secular arms bearers. As promised then, let's return to the image from the 14th century manuscript with which I started of Christ leading the Crusaders. The manuscript in question is in fact a French commentary on the book of Revelation, and the painting accompanies chapter 19, concerning the rider on the white horse. Here the image, as well as the commentary, makes it explicit that the rider is Christ. Ecclesiastical chroniclers who wrote about the First Crusade, helpfully personified here in the figure of John of Patmos, clearly thought about the expedition in eschatological terms. What I'm proposing is that perhaps some of the knights who went on crusade in the Middle Ages, embodied in the image of the mounted troops behind Christ, did so too. Now, I'm going to end by showing you something I simply couldn't resist, including in my paper. So by a curious twist of fate, the square in Brussels in which that 1848 statue of the first Crusader Godfrey of Bouillon stands has been the location recently of Extinction Rebellion protests. So I'm not sure how familiar the protesters were with the writings of Pseudo-Methodius. Perhaps they would be pleased to know that their demonstrations were being watched over by a figure who, as some thought, succeeded in averting the apocalypse almost 1,000 years ago by refusing a crown in Jerusalem. Yeah, maybe things were just simpler in the Middle Ages when it came to avoiding the apocalypse. Thank you very much.